Hi, I'm Don Harrold. How are you? Last month in July of 2008, Republican presidential candidate Ron Paul, congressman from Texas, had an interesting exchange, almost comical, humorous if you will, with Massachusetts Democrat Barney Frank.
How's your wife compared to what? And the Federal Reserve compared to what? I don't see any alternative to the Federal Reserve.
I would like to take a minute to just challenge something he said during his questioning, because he made the flat statement that there was no alternative to the Federal Reserve System. Now, I don't want to take my time to explain the alternative, but maybe later on, Chairman Frank and I can talk, and I can explain to him what an alternative might be.
That's not very likely.
Now, after watching that, I thought, maybe Barney Frank doesn't want to know, but I'd like to find out what alternatives there are to the Federal Reserve. So I thought, who better to ask than the congressman himself? So today I interviewed Dr. Ron Paul, the leader of the Freedom Revolution, and you'll be surprised at his answers about, well, Barney Frank and the Federal Reserve, I think. But at the end, he gives some great advice on what you and I can do as citizens to help protect the freedoms that we've got now and gain back the freedoms we've lost. And now for my interview with Congressman Ron Paul. There was an interesting exchange between you and Representative Barney Frank, where you mentioned that sometime later you could explain to him an alternative to the Federal Reserve. Although Representative Frank didn't want to hear that, would you mind sharing with my viewers one of the options you'd have in mind outside of the Federal Reserve System?
Well, he knew exactly what I was referring to, because we've talked about it a lot. And although he wasn't interested in it, actually, we do pretty well getting along together. And he was trying to make a pun there by saying, well, that is not going to happen. But he knows my position, because I don't even believe we should have a Federal Reserve. And of course, he sees things so differently. He sees that the Federal Reserve is important, and if we only had more regulations by Congress, we could compensate and correct all the errors that the Federal Reserve makes or helps to make, by creating artificially low interest rates. So that was sort of somewhat of an inside joke, but he was very clear. He wasn't going to hear anything. He wasn't in the mood at that particular time to hear about getting rid of the Federal Reserve.
What do you do without the Federal Reserve?
Well, we have only had the Federal Reserve since 1913. It was imperfect before then, because there were always attempts to develop something similar to a Federal Reserve, such as the First and Second National Banks, and even during the Civil War period, there was very much involvement in the national banking system. But free market banking is something that could exist. But the important thing is not to concede to the bankers and the politicians this right to create money out of thin air. That's the culprit. And especially if they're doing this to accommodate politicians who spend too much money, and where the Fed can buy Treasury bills with credit created out of thin air. This is where the problem is. But I'm not in favor of closing the Federal Reserve down in one single day, because that could be, make it even more chaotic than it already is. But I'd be for trying to work out a transition period where a parallel standard could work side by side with the paper money standard and have competing currencies.
But when I look at what's happening with the Federal Reserve right now, I see literally the opposite taking place. They're being granted more and more powers and more oversight in ways that even the greatest conspiracy theorists of the 70s and early 80s could never have dreamed of. What can we do about it?
Well, Don, the way I figure this is going to continue, and it's exactly right. We're not winning this argument. The Fed is getting more powerful, and the plans right now will not only have the Fed in charge of the banking system, but the entire financial system, the investment banks, Wall Street and all its firms. And, bailing out Bear Stearns is not exactly an original function of the central banking system that was there to create credit for a liquidity crisis. But they're bailing out corporations. And all these powers are not locked in place. But Congress doesn't resist it. Most members of Congress don't really understand what it is. They don't see the danger in it. And the worse the crisis gets, the more the politicians are going to hope, well, maybe the Fed's going to bail us out. And just think of how many problems we had in the 90s and that, 15 years or so when Greenspan was chairman. The politicians thought he was, a genius. And, all he was doing was inflating the currency. So they had a lot of trust, blind trust, in the central bank to solve all the problems rather than seeing the central bank as the source of our problems.
What would you say to the viewers of my videos that they can do right now to make changes in their lives or help Congress affect change for the entire country?
Of course, there's two things that we are obligated to do for ourselves. One, we're obligated to protect ourselves financially, and if you come to the conclusion that the Congress will inevitably spend too much and the Federal Reserve is going to be there and continue to monetize debt and continue to devalue our currency, then protecting themselves financially, I believe, is the only way you can do this, is through having our hard assets. I was a purchaser of gold, when gold was under $100 an ounce, and it has served me well. So I think we have an obligation to ourselves and our family to try to preserve our capital and our wealth. But there's another thing that I'm involved in that I think is even more important, and that is protecting our freedoms and trying to raise up a new generation that really believes the Constitution is worth saving. And that's why I've campaigned for office. That's why I have a new organization called Campaign for Liberty, and people who are interested in that can go to campaignforliberty.com. And I think that ultimately is the thing to do, because we can have a gun in our house and we can have stored food and we have our gold coin.